recording. Great, I call the House to order. Gov, whenever you're ready.
Cool.
Sorry, can I get like 5 seconds?
Yeah,
That's
sure.
okay. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. If Op wants to ask a POI, I will happily take one. Just say POI, like unmute yourself, because I may not have the chat available to me. Okay, let's start time now. The Black Panther Party is not Malcolm X. It's not the Nation of Islam. The Black Panther Party was founded on the death of Malcolm X, who famously said that he would achieve his ends by any means necessary. But it's important to note that by any means necessary does not connote violence in every instance. By any means necessary means exactly that you're willing to use a multitude of means to achieve your intended outcomes. You're willing to work across the aisle. You're willing to work with people who have differing political ends, as long as those people are committed to an overarching goal of protecting Black people from racial injustice. We think that this policy helps us towards those goals, so we're happy to support it. Our model is very similar. Other than just accepting the money, we only want to support non-violent causes with this money specifically. We just think it's the most practical way to achieve this, given that we already know that the state is opposed to the most violent forms of activism, and given that PFMCs don't really have a violent purpose per se. We wouldn't train people to go and engage in violent protests. We wouldn't give them weapons with this money, etc. Aside from that, you can make arguments about how it's likely to be used. Okay. We think this is better at achieving the goals of the Black Panther Party for 3 separate reasons. Number one, we think this changes the incentives of the government and prevents a worse outcome when it comes to state targeting. The first thing I want to explain is that right now, the highest degree of threat that you face as an organization comes from the backlash to large-scale violent activism and civil unrest that your organization causes. Local police, the FBI, and the federal government have a massive incentive to target you to show that they're tough on crime, to show that they will not tolerate civil unrest, and to portray you as an radical organization as possible. You do not have a major political stakeholder on your side right now when you have the Nixon administration currently in power, which is working to crush the civil rights movements that came to prominence during the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, and that wants to demonstrate a strong federal response in order to get away from concerns about things like Watergate and the Vietnam War. The reason they're offering you this money, though, is because they have a countervailing incentive, which is also to demonstrate that they're effective on domestic policy, to show that they can help fight poverty and make a meaningful difference for the lives of lots of people, including Black people. And so by offering you this money, this is your silver bullet chance to get the government off of your back. By accepting this cash, it means that you now have a political stakeholder on your side, and the most unlikely one possible, which is the Nixon admin, because the Nixon administration now knows that if they target these PFMCs and they're directly contradicting or going against one of their stated policy aims, they're directly undermining the effectiveness of their war on poverty. So it makes it a lot more likely that the Nixon administration is likely to put pressure on local or state or city governments to get the police off of your back and minimize the targeting of these PFMCs. It also, however, means that you're more likely to get support from other stakeholders that could more realistically come to support you in the near term. So for example, many of these PFMCs exist in cities because these are where African Americans tend to be concentrated at this time, and city governments tend to be more liberal because they have more diverse populations and also have people who are lower income. So you have a large number of Democratic people who could be sympathizers to your ends, Democratic local governments that could get the local police off of your back, but you need to demonstrate to these organizations that your entire goal is not just violence or civil unrest, that you're willing to make a meaningful change through peaceful and nonviolent ends, and accepting this cash and expanding the role of these PFMCs is an excellent way to do this. Now, let's see that even in the worst case scenario, the government maximally wants to attack you on either side of the house. They will never be your friend. Why then is it still worse for you to reject this money? Because rejecting this money plays into every single argument that the right wants to make about the Black Panther Party. It plays into the argument that you don't care about any kind of outcome other than violent outcomes. It weakens your coalition because now liberal or moderate sympathizers in these cities and these states are less likely to support your ends and are more likely to vote for tough on crime politicians who explicitly make the argument that because you rejected this money, you cannot be trusted to push forward any kind of moderate agenda. The only agenda that you want is one that tears down the state. And so even in the case in which you're not likely to get the government on your side on either side, you're still going to face more generalized targeting on the opposition side of the house. We just think that the impact of this is massive at the point in which more people in your movement are likely to be locked up or die, directly contradicting your aim of liberating Black people from the criminal justice system that is so flawed, but also as an increases the incentive for people to bow out of your movement, the more they infer a massive risk to their physical security every time they choose to participate in any violent or non-violent action by the Black Panther Party. Conversely, when you show that you're willing to work with the state, it also means that more people are likely to join and work with your organization because they recognize that the risk to themselves for doing so is lower. Second point, this gives you more resources, which directly improves your activism. There are 3 points under this. The first one is that just having more money makes it more effective for you to achieve your ends, right? What are the goals of these PFMCs? Largely, you're helping people with things like health, and you're providing legal aid and political education to individuals. These are some of the most massive barriers to activism, so relieving these barriers is really important to getting more people on the ground. For example, if you can provide for people's health and they know that they will receive healthcare if they face an injury in, for example, a protest, no matter what the color of their skin is, it means people infer less of a risk to participation in protests. Or if you can provide legal aid and political education, it means that you can train activists to engage in non-violent protests, and people know that you'll provide legal defense for them in the case in which they get locked up or get arrested. And so having more resources on your side just means you can do this for more people with more efficacy and have more demonstrable cases of this succeeding, which means people perceive that they're more willing to go into activism and actually take those risks that come with it intrinsically. Secondly, more money also means you can pay more people. Note that most people, specifically the people who are likely to sympathize with your movement, are low income. They're often working jobs for more than 40 hours a week at something like minimum wage. And so these people have an incredibly high trade-off to their time at the point at which they're trying to support themselves and their families. That means that it's very unlikely that you can get a large number of volunteers to come and take care of people who are the least well off. When you have more money on your side, it means you can pay people. It means you can convert volunteers into social workers that are actually making a wage. It means you can recruit more people to join these clinics in the first place, which directly expands your power to aid the health of Black people and makes people more willing to invest their limited time in the Black Panther Party's agenda. Notably, this also expands the size of your coalition, because even if there are people who are not sympathetic to the so-called violent aims of the Black Panther Party, they may be sympathetic to doing work to help people in terms of healthcare and things like that. But when you bring more people into your network, you give them a first way to engage with these PFMCs, they're more likely to become integrated into the Black Panther Party more generally, to find common cause with other aspects of your programming, to participate in protests and activism and things like that. You bring more people into your network with more resources, we think that's always a good thing. We also think that even if you don't achieve any of your other macro political aims, just having more people helping people on the ground with things like healthcare is something you intrinsically care about, right? Worse health is one of the most direct consequences of racial discrimination and violence, to the point where you are willing to use any means necessary to mitigate the harms of racial violence. We think this is a great way to achieve that. Third and final point under this, you also increase perceived efficacy. So one of the largest concerns people have about the Black Panther Party is that you can't achieve meaningful political aims versus, for example, the moderate wings of the civil rights movement, like Dr. King's movement, that are more focused on nonviolent protests and that have actually achieved some kind of meaningful political outcomes under LBJ's administration. Now, Op will probably say the left is going to be very mad at you for doing this. We don't think the far left of the civil rights movement has anywhere meaningfully to go. The largest group that you can swing to your side are more moderate individuals who are concerned that you can't actually make meaningful change within the system. Just by making this policy change, you are signaling to them that you are willing to work both inside and outside the system to make change. That means a large group of people is more likely to swing to your side. We just think that having a larger base of people is a force multiplier. It means you can get more concessions from local governments to reduce police targeting of people in your community. It means you can get more concessions in terms of things like welfare policy and things like that. To the point at which this improves the goals that you want by any means necessary, we're very proud to propose.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Cool. It's been a while since I did after, so bear with me. But starting my time in 3, 2, 1. 2 bits of framing. First, realize that opposition to this type of policies was insane, right? In that when like something similar tried to be done in Philadelphia with some type of healthcare office, their office literally got bombed because of the amount of backlash here. It's hard to underestimate the degree to which city cops and other types of institutions try to demonize and try to vilify these people. What does this explicitly do? Then we think that it creates a target for backlash and an explicit target for people's back for a lot of the vitriol that's coming out against these clinics that prevents a lot of the accessibility, increasing efficacy the government would try to go for. Second bit of framing under this, though, just realize the government at this point in time was insanely cruel to minorities. They literally just finished segregation a couple of years ago. Right-wingers therefore always have an incentive to demonize regardless of what actions you pursue, because that's a stayed in power for the last 40 years. That's the same type of rhetoric that they're going to do. We don't think there's a meaningful tipping point in the types of rhetoric that right-wingers are trying to do. Cool then. Three bits of extension I want to talk about. First, just clearly define what the counterfactual is going to be on our side of the house. First, we think a lot of these funds, if you care about the economics, a lot of the resources, will just be more community sourced and grassroots based. First, why are we able to get these grassroots funding? Because first off, we think a lot of the community support and that people realize that healthcare is important. We think it's a unifying cause that'll bring in people, especially from the minority communities to which these communities are coming from. Secondarily, a lot of the allies that they're talking about, especially if you buy their argument that cities and whatever are woke and full of liberals, we think you probably draw allies from then, right? Who probably realize that the government is racist after seeing the Vietnam War, the Korean War, et cetera, et cetera. There's huge government disillusionment that probably swings that type of support to your side of us, which means you don't need any government support. Why is this likely to be sufficient then? Because realize the types of services they're going to be providing here are not vastly expensive, right? Like we're not trying to build our own hospital here. This is not providing surgery, providing brain care, really complex stuff that requires a lot of money or equipment. Rather more basic services like checkups, healing wounds, et cetera, that are more akin to what you see in healthcare clinics today. This means the cost to provide these is a lot smaller. You don't need time to do it, but you need a lot more access, which is you're able to do on our side of us. You don't need some big government paycheck, which is that their side is largely non-unique. But why is our side of us services grassroots support and other community-based alternatives preferable? Because one, you get the same types of grassroots support, but you're not beholden to large institutions, which is always better because you're not beholden to one big stakeholder that overrides any decision you offers you like more informed looking, whatever. Second thing that why this is preferable is that it's just better advice, better education, better treatment, because it's more relatable. The types of legal education, types of political education on their side of the house, it's just one of patriotism, right? It looks like don't do drugs or you can vote or other types of prescriptive advice rather than the more relatable type of advice. It's the same reason why many white-facing rich economists now are confused and demean the economic choices of low-income communities when they say spend money on festivals or say spend money on like more trivial things, right? Because they don't understand the shoes that they walk in. On our side of the house, we offer more space and a larger percentage of the space for those types of voices on our side of the house. No, thank you. Cool. Second thing I want to say under this is a principle argument for why you don't accept money from the institution that literally enforced and implemented the systemic racism that created your existence to fight against. This point, underline it, cannot be overstated anymore. First off, why did the government uniquely contribute to this type of state-sanctioned racism and violence? Couple of things. One, it just led to a normalized set of policies that are racist, right? The government was literally one that set for the 3/5 clause, gerrymandering, segregation, all types of voter suppression efforts to keep Black people from meaningfully participating in democracy. Why is this uniquely problematic for the government? First, because at the point where the government is literally the only public institution available to minority communities, but at the same time is the institution shutting out these minorities, then you violate people's democratic consent. Second, because government normalized this discourse within the broad stream of society. At the point where the government literally decides what type of content is acceptable or not for people to be jailed, then and these types of attitudes that have an effect on government basically just has an effect on normalizing this types of discourse within mainstream society, even if it is done within private organizations, because they see what the government's doing, they see the set of morality and code of conduct the government's doing, and they adjust accordingly. Therefore, why is it a bad thing to take this money? Oliver will blow up in this in ML, but the first thing is just it creates an optics of dependency, right? It detracts from your ability to push for the most radical sector of your policy. To quickly flag this to their off-case point, they try to say, oh, you need moderates. Moderates are the break swing of support that you're going to get. No, I don't think you're ever going to get moderates, right? Because if you're getting moderates, they're coming into the civil rights movement. They're not jumping into the Black Panther Party specifically. They're probably going to go to another type of party or another more moderate type of party that's like, I don't know, the type of policies that MLK or other people are choosing for, right? This is important because the only type of people, the broad base of support that you're going to get is on the more radical side of things. That's the only audience that we care about. Second thing I want to say, this distracts from, this is important because radical policies are what's needed, right? We don't care about moving the needle slightly when the situation is already so fucked up for your people. I don't care if you achieve marginal progress or if you create more like stability politics, because all that does is create an illusion of false solvency that prevents much larger reforms in those sectors from taking place because the people are complicit. The last argument I want to say is just how do you get worse healthcare outcomes on their side of the house, worse outcomes overall? First, you just get less community buy-in and trust on their side of the house. At this point, the government is doing the Tuskegee trials, MK Ultra, and a bunch of other fucked up healthcare outcomes to Black people. These are all situations where the government literally withheld treatment, withheld quality care, and did not step in to help minority communities, leading to a lot of fear and trust. This therefore decreases trust from minority communities to access these institutions. Why? Because one, they're paranoid about the type of treatment that they could receive. Two, they're unsure about if they're receiving healthcare with no strings attached. And three, there are concerns about privacy violations. The whole Big Brother thing, like will my data be used against me, whatever. First impact then is just why Why is losing this community trust a bad thing then? Because we think this meaningfully becomes a tipping point for people choosing to access treatment or to not, like do it at home, not seek treatment, just general worse healthcare outcomes. Note, we're going to preempt the government response here, but people need medical healthcare. They need these types of situations. If you need surgery, you go to the hospital regardless of trust. How do we preempt this? Because the point of these clinics is not about life-threatening or severe injuries. Like, yes, if you're going to die soon, then you go to the hospital. But it doesn't change on both sides of the house. What we're talking about is a much larger population of people with moderate to severe injuries, those types of chronic conditions that cause discomfort and cause pain, but aren't going to kill you. Now, community trust matters a lot more because of the literal tipping point between you sucking it up versus seeking treatment that comes to the opportunity cost of going to get treatment, et cetera, et cetera. Yet chronic treatment and chronic pain matters a lot because these are types of pains that people feel the most on a day-to-day basis. Directly ties into happiness because if you're dealing with your situation, dealing with your illness, then you can not meaningfully access your daily life, et cetera, et cetera. This means their side just doesn't access people actively seeking treatment because they're fearful of the repercussions. Second impact of this is that makes free public healthcare or those types of better reforms harder in the long term because it gets propped up as an example for why free healthcare will inevitably fail, making it much harder to achieve the long term. Why is it likely to fail? Because by the impacts of community trust, less people go there, it meaningfully becomes seen then as people had the option to go but chose not to. So why should we meaningfully roll out on a large scale? This is bad because it means you don't develop the critical infrastructure to scale up healthcare. You need these large types of reforms because that's how you become more efficient because you have better economies of scale. You're better able to consolidate information to do it on a worse situation overall. Cool. So now moving on case, right? First thing I want to say is about they're on their arguments about Nixon as a whole. One, we literally said that Nixon is the worst possible ally that you want. Every single civil society organization hates him. You can't build coalitions because you've allied yourself with the one political actor that everyone hates, right? Second thing that they try to say is about changing the incentives of the government because they say that essentially the government will buy into you doing this because that's how they boost their domestic policy ratings. One, I think Nixon probably is not worried about losing his reelection for the next couple of years. So I don't see why he has a massive incentive to care to you, especially when he can do a lot of other actions to sort of boost his domestic policy ratings. Secondarily, he got here for being tough on crime. So I think doing this detracts from his image. Third thing I'd probably want to say under this is no, even if you buy their best case world and Nixon is completely cool with the non-violent actions that you're doing, that's the only thing that he signed off on, right? So at the point where the Black Panther Party becomes if there's one flashpoint incident, if there's other types of more radical, more violent types of actions, then he immediately condemns it. He tries to corral it in. That's the type of pulling strings that you see on their side of the house, right? Cool. At the point they say other Democrats and whatever support you, we're fine with them supporting, just do it on a grassroots basis. That's not within the scope of this debate. Second thing they say is that it gives you more resources and it's always a good thing to get more money and whatever. I already preempted this in my argument when I told you that the more money that they get on their side of the house, one, is not needed, but secondarily actively drowns out the more relatable voice, the more minority positions of support that you probably get on their side of the house. That is meaningfully important to access community trust because it does not matter if you have the best resource in the world. If you create distrust from people from accessing those resources, then it literally means to nothing. It doesn't terminalize the impact. You don't get the type of stuff that they want. The last thing that they talk about is personal efficiency for you're able to sway moderates. Moderates do not matter in this debate. If they're going to come to the civil rights movement, they're going to go to a different organization. You only care about pushing the most radical set of policies, pushing the Overton window. You can only do that when you appeal to people who hate Nixon, and you lose that at the point when you do this motion. We're very proud to oppose.
Okay, this might be tough, but can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. If it gets unclear or you for some reason I cut out, you can just, I guess use the Discord messages. That way I can see. Is that okay?
Sounds
all right. Yeah, I'm gonna go off case on case. All right. The first observation that we hear is that healthcare offices are bombed and they're targeted for backlash. This is a reason to vote Gov. The more resources that you supply to these PFMCs, the more money they can funnel into security and to training officers to avoid these kinds of problems. The second argument we hear is that the government is cruel towards minorities and that segregation was not long ago. Sure, but also not long ago was the 1964 Civil Rights Act and a lot of other progress that was made towards minorities, which indicates that the government is at least amenable towards adopting additional reforms that help the cause of Black people. So again, both of these observations are not necessarily reasons to default for the op. First argument we hear is that this hurts your grassroots ability to raise funds. First, we hear that there's a lot of community funding and that for some reason this is enough. Two responses. One, the communities that you are receiving funding from are oftentimes low income and concentrated urban minorities where there's not a lot of economic opportunity because they've been denied this for centuries by things like redlining and Jim Crow. This means that even if they are getting money from the community, it's not going to be much, and we're going to argue that it's not going to be enough. The second response, though, is that we aren't going to trade off with community funding for a few reasons. One, when communities see that you are no longer in danger from government attacking you or bombing your hospitals and clinics, they're probably more likely to agree that this is a viable solution for actually spreading mutual aid and policy. But two, people are not going to be turned away. They're probably going to realize that this makes your government or this makes your movement more efficacious, and so they're going to be more likely to donate. Next, we hear that cities are woke and liberal, so they'll give you a lot of money, and that grassroots is not a problem. Couple of responses. One, even if they are woke and liberal, they will probably support the SLCC or Martin Luther King's movement rather than yours. This is probably empirically true. Like if you look at California, they generally are pretty they're generally pretty supportive of like moderate Democrats rather than super liberal ones. I mean, I guess Bernie won in 2016, but in 2020 that wasn't the case. And also broadly, they're more likely and more inclined to support MLK because they don't want violence in their backyard, and they would rather have non-violent protests because this makes them seem performatively aligned with the movement, but not actually willing to accept the violence that comes with it. They probably don't donate to you. Then we hear that, and this is going to be important, that the kinds of activism that happen in these medical clinics is not vastly expensive. It's just checkups. The cost is low. Few responses. One, they're not being very charitable to us. Then we can have more clinics if we have more money. So even if you think that the clinics don't cost a lot of money, we can spread them to other parts of the country where there's probably less available funding. There's less grassroots availability, perhaps in rural or suburban areas where there's not as much money. And so that we can spread the clinics there. And this is obviously good for the Black Panther Party, and it also helps a lot of people. Second, and this was not responded to out of PMC, we can pay our volunteers. This is obviously good for a few reasons. One, because it trades off with the fungible amount of money that they would otherwise have to go to work for, because a lot of these, again, volunteers are low income, they work minimum wage jobs, they don't have as much time to take off. So when you can pay them, they can work longer hours and they can spend more time in the clinics. And three, we just disagree with their characterization. We don't think that it is very cheap to apply medical care. Couple of reasons why. One, prescription drugs in the United States are incredibly expensive. They're locked behind patents and they cost a lot of money. In order to buy them over the counter, it costs way more money than it would in any other comparable developed country, which means that it does cost a lot of money. Two, the medical equipment necessary just even to do basic checkups, like if you need like a stethoscope, that kind of medical equipment is still very expensive, especially considering that people are not going to be happy to sell towards the Black Panther Party. And so they're probably going to mark up the rates. So any additional money helps. So we think that, again, their characterization of these checkups being not expensive is incredibly unfair to us and probably not true. But even if it was, we could just argue around that by saying we built more clinics in more areas, and so we still get offense there. Finally, we hear this bit of offense about how we shouldn't patronize and we shouldn't basically tell Black people that their decisions are invalid or that their medical conditions are their fault. And we think that the Gov is in the best position to solve this. Because if you go to a traditional clinic, you go to the traditional hospital, you're going to have doctors that aren't trained in working with these urban minority populations. And so they engage in this kind of subtle racist microaggressions. Whereas on our side of the house, the people who actually volunteer in the Black Panther PFMCs are probably going to be people who have experience with the racism in the medical system and know that it's patronizing, so they can solve back for it better than the other alternatives. So we think that if you want to solve this issue, you vote Gov. Second argument, I hope everyone can hear me. Second argument is that there's a principled reason not to accept the money. On the principle, reject this on face. The literal slogan, the mantra of the Black Panther Party is by any means necessary. So the principle is that we have to get to our goals. It has nothing to do with whether we oppose the government unconditionally. If the government can conditionally help us get to our goals, then it's better. So on principle, you can reject this argument. The real way that this argument generates offense is that it might scare people off, right? The other people might see that the government is racist and that, the Black Panthers are becoming dependent on them and this is going to be bad for their optics. Few responses here. One, they have not responded to the analysis out of PMC, which will lose them the round, which is that most of these left-wing progressives and supporters of the movement have nowhere to go. If they don't join the Black Panther Party, then they have no other organization which is comparably as large and also has radical roots. The problem is that these people have terminally high incentives to engage in activism. Why do we know this? Because there's a revealed preference. The fact that they live in these difficult communities, they work low-end 9-to-5 jobs with not a lot of income and probably are exposed to violence all the time, means that volunteering is probably one of the worst things that they could do for their pragmatic outcomes, right? If you wanted to have the best outcomes, you probably wouldn't volunteer. You would stay home, avoid the police lashing out against you, and probably try to work more to improve your material conditions. So the fact that they still go out and volunteer proves that they have a terminally high incentive to do so, and that they were always going to engage in activism. As a result, if they don't engage in activism with the Black Panther Party, the only viable alternatives are the more moderate ones, like MLK's SLCC, or the other, civil rights movements that are generally opposed to nonviolence and generally not by any means necessary, willing to go to the ends necessary to achieve racial justice, which means that even if they are turned off by this one decision, they still will stay within the movement because they have no alternatives. Couple of other responses. We think that the bigger barrier to entry for these radicals is not the fact that, you take one additional grant from the United States government, which is probably a small issue on the fence for some people. The vast majority of people are probably turned off by the fact that, one, they don't have enough money and they have to spend all their time working, and two, that they're going to be exposed to violence. And we solve for both of these arguments by, one, giving them money because now we have grants, and two, by getting the government off of our back because they are unlikely to engage in violent crackdowns on organizations that they are directly funding. So we think that on the whole, people will be more likely to join rather than be turned off. Then we hear this argument about dependency. They say the government will prevent you from doing the policies you want. Listen, you're not being very charitable to the Black Panther Party. If they discover that, for example, these grants come with conditions that say that they can't engage in violent activism or they can't engage in community patrolling, we think that it's very likely that they will just no longer accept these grants. We're doing this on good faith. We're assuming not perfect, but we're assuming reasonable implementation, and we're assuming the Black Panther Party will not allow themselves to become dependent. If they do find that they are, they can easily just say no longer that we will be taking the grants. Third argument is that we get worse outcomes in public health, and the warranting here is essentially that there's going to be less community buy-in because there's a lot of this communal scarring from previous instances of government violence, like the Tuskegee experiment and MK Ultra. Few responses. One, people do not know about these experiments yet. These were declassified in documents years after they happened. People don't know about these. But on the other hand, people do know directly what their experiences are with the actual healthcare system, which is they've experienced that typical hospitals run in cities that generally don't treat urban minorities probably treat them in racist ways and probably treat them with patronizing language. Or, for example, Black women are more likely to die in childbirth or are more likely to have their symptoms of pain ignored because doctors don't trust them because they have implicit bias. So they're more likely to know about that kind of violence or racism in the healthcare system as opposed to all otherwise. So if anything, this is actually going to increase public buy-in because now that they have more funding, people will believe in them more. Then they say that these clinics only do things for non-severe injuries, but then they knife this argument immediately later by saying that chronic issues matter, so we still solve there. Then they say that we can't scale to healthcare and get medical care for everyone, but we just think this is path dependent on the arguments about activism, and also we just think that there's no way that we're going to get universal healthcare in the United States in the 60s at this time or in the 70s. So this argument isn't even there. First, they say that Nixon is not worried about re-election because, I don't know, I guess he's popular, but no, he's not because Watergate's attended. He's caring about doing literally everything to get his popular rating back up. Second, he says that they got here on being tough on crime, and we don't think this precludes this. We just think that he also wants to help people in clinics. Then he says that you can do other policies, but very few other policies would have the effect of this because this directly reaches out to a community that he's otherwise marginalized. Then they say that we don't get moderates. This is fairly uncharitable to us. We're not saying that moderates will join the Black Panther Party. We're saying that we shift the Overton window so that they no longer view the Black Panther Party as solely violent and solely interested in destroying America. So they're less likely to, for example, call the police on them, or less likely to call for their extermination, and more likely to internalize them into their politics, which is all we're asking for. That's all we need on our side of the house. We're very proud to propose. Were you able to hear all of that?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize for the background noise and anything else.
One second here. I'll get the timer.
Can I just ask, is there any chance that you will take a POI?
Absolutely not. I'm sorry. Nothing against you guys. I'm bad at POIs and APTA. Yeah. Okay, cool. Is everyone ready? Pretty simple, couple observations, then off and on. Cool. 2 observations. I think the first is that I think the problem is not that people don't know about the Tuskegee experiments, and more that Black communities in the 1970s, minority communities in general, their experience with the healthcare system has been one of violence. I think they actually knife themselves because they literally tell you this. They're like, the Tuskegee experiment stuff hasn't been declassified, but people only have experience of violence in the healthcare system. That is our broader point. It is that these minority communities have a real problem with seeking standard forms of healthcare because their only interaction with this healthcare has been hearing stories of violence and systemic racism. Okay, we'll mechanize that in a second. I think the second overall observation, though, is that you need radical groups in society to access societal change. You need radical groups advocating for radical solutions. Again, we're going to mechanize that in a second. Cool. So the first thing they tell you is that this is great because you get more money for security. Couple of responses. One, we think security is a really bad idea because our entire idea with this round is that, look, Black individuals, minority individuals are not going to go to standard forms of healthcare because of their experiences with violence in the system. So you need non-governmental forms of healthcare in order for these people to access healthcare in the first place. I think the problem is that when you take a bunch of money from the government and then station security guards outside your healthcare observation, it's pretty easy to see how this works like against everything that you are trying to do, right? Because then you just make yourself look like this official organ of the state that people aren't going to go to. I think the second response, though, is also, I didn't start my timer, so I don't know when I'm going to end. The second response, though, is just like, again, people aren't going to go to this. Like locals are going, or the second response to this is like, just because you get federal money does not necessarily mean you're going to end local harassment, right? Like federal money is decoupled from local harassment of like local police officers and healthcare officials going to your operation and harassing you. I don't necessarily know that these things are going to end. I don't necessarily know that you're going to be able to deal with these problems. Then the next thing they tell you is that the government is not necessarily bad in this type of situation. I think the problem, though, is that insofar as at this point in the 1970s, the government is actively doing things like redlining, actively engaging in discrimination, and actively engaging in projects with which the BPP is incredibly aware of. I think it is very difficult to justify to your members why you're accepting money from an institution that is actively being racist. I think that is the problem. The problem is not that the government was racist in 1956 and that poses a problem in 1970. The problem is that I think all of us, since we're all probably pretty intelligent individuals, realize the government was incredibly racist at this point in time, right? That's a problem for people like the BPP and retaining members. Then they tell you you're not going to have enough money from the community. The response is, one, people aren't going to go if you accept federal money because they think now you're a part of the state and their only experience with the state is with violence in the healthcare system. Second, I think that people are more likely to donate to you than pay their taxes insofar as you are literally the only medical system that minority individuals trust in these neighborhoods. They have incredible appreciation for the services you provide. I think they're willing to put up the money necessary for you to continue. And I think third, you can still just get a random like white woke donors to donate to your operation. I think the fourth response, though, is like, if you have a severe public health crisis or some severe crisis someone is like having, you can still send them to the hospital if you need to do that. Cool. Then they tell you that like white people are only going to support moderate causes. I think this is like first two responses. One, this is probably somewhat true, but I think the second response, though, is like, look, your community has such tremendous buy-in to your organization that I think you're able to raise the level of funds. If you have 10,000 people in your community and they see you as the only healthcare resource, they're probably willing to donate enough money for you to continue operating, right? In a system that is similar to taxes. They do not, I think, provide you the analysis or the warranting necessary to show you why this wouldn't be true. Cool. Now they tell you can get more clinics because you have more money to do so. I think one, the point is like, no one is going to go to these clinics because they see it as federal money. Like they just don't deal with this point. They really need to deal with it in the next speech. Otherwise they lose around. So it doesn't really matter if you build more clinics or not. I think the second is like, you're going to have huge conservative backlash. Right? Because essentially what conservatives are going to say is like, hey, the government is only funding healthcare projects in minority communities. I think then the conservatives are probably going to get more support in the long term, meaning they're going to take away healthcare from these communities, and meaning that even if you buy that this money works effectively in these clinics, when you suddenly pull the money from the clinics, these clinics probably collapse and they now don't have the grassroots support to continue going independent of the government. But again, the bigger problem is no one goes to them in the first place because they literally don't trust the government. Cool. I also just think the third response here, though, is just that, look, the Black Panther Party is going to fucking splinter if you do this, right? Like there are certain individuals in the Black Panther Party that just want absolutely nothing to do with the government. I think the context that Devesh completely misses is that the BPP and similar organizations literally wouldn't take water from municipalities, wouldn't rack up electricity bills because they weren't willing to be associated with the state. Insofar as these are factual things that happened, you can buy the fact that there are certain contingents in the BPP are going to be like, this is fucking stupid. They're going to splinter, which means you splinter support, which means these organizations are less affected in the future, which also means it's easier for the government to just co-opt the interests of the BPP, which means you have one less very powerful, radical, organized voice advocating for Black rights. Instead, you have fucking Nixon controlling an organization, which they, for some reason, think is a really good idea. Cool. Then they tell you need lots of money for drugs and prescriptions and stuff, and this allows you to access that. I think one, people have recurring insurance and stuff, which covers a lot of these basic expenses. Two, They don't deal with the analysis that checkups and really basic injuries, like, I don't know, putting a Band-Aid on someone or giving someone birth control is pretty inexpensive. And third, people really support this clinic. So even if you don't buy this point, if you just buy the fact that every single person in a given community is not willing to go to a hospital, which is probably factually true, then they're also probably willing to contribute the money to allow this clinic to continue going, or at least some of the doctors in the community will volunteer their hours or something. There are ways that these communities get around these problems that I don't think they deal with. Cool. Then they bring up this really funny quote that the BPP has, which is like, by any means necessary, we're going to achieve our goals. I think the problem, though, is like, the BPP's goal is like not to work with systemically racist institutions, right? Like, I also just think, like, even if the BPP is willing to work with systemically racist institutions, their goal is to better them for the advancement of Black and minority individuals. The problem is that they have not given you a mechanism by which you can actually improve things. They tell you that Nixon is suddenly going to go to the wall for you. One, why is Nixon going to do this? And two, why would you want Nixon to do this for you? Literally everyone hates you. I didn't even want to start this round at the idea that Watergate has already happened because it's so bad for government. But if they already concede that Watergate has happened, then you literally, this like adds on to your like reasons you wouldn't accept money from the government, because not only are they racist, but the government in charge is literally hated by every other political faction. You know they're about to lose power. You know they're about to go down. Why would you build allies in a government faction that isn't going to persist? Cool. Let's find the other parts of the notes I have. Oh, okay. Then they tell you that people are just going to end up going to moderate parties, and they're not going to join the PPP if you don't take these funds and whatnot. I think the problem is when you do this, again, they're going to splinter. You have radical factions. That's really bad. I think, too, you're probably also going to have a faction that is extremely confused by you doing this. And I think the third response is that you're still just going to have a faction that's like, wait a second, the BPP is engaging with the federal government. Maybe I'll just stay home and not protest. I just think that you probably have less buy-in, or you have more radical groups. In either case, you just have fewer like legitimate institutions that have been around for a while advocating for the rights of minority individuals, which is probably a normatively bad thing. Cool. Then they tell you, yeah, people don't know about Tuskegee and whatnot, but then they literally knife that by saying that people know all about violence in the healthcare system. So that point doesn't matter. Cool. And then again, they said Nixon just did Watergate, so they'll be nice to these individuals and whatnot. He has a huge incentive to play ball with these organizations. He's a bad ally. Everyone hates him. He has no political capital. Very, very proud to oppose.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I like cut out a little bit during Emma, but I heard most of it. So if I cut out or something, if you can't hear me, just put it in the chat. Yeah. Cool. Right. Cool. With that, I'm gonna start my time in 3, 2, 1. Government loses this round the second that they want to place all of their political advocacy into an administration that is literally about to get impeached. Everyone hates them in the government, and like there's massive backlash against them. If you buy all of that characterization, then probably seeming in opposition to Nixon is probably a good thing, right? Because it probably means all the other Republicans that hate Nixon probably jump on board. You probably get support from like moderate leftists, whatever. If everyone is unified in hating Nixon, probably a good thing to not be on his side of the house. Cool. Let's go through this round though, right? What's the biggest things that you care about from government's case? Because look, the tagline that government tries to go for is by any means necessary. 2 reasons then why they don't pick up on that simple framework. First, more money and more resources are not a good thing at the point where it actively dilutes from positive support, i.e. if you have government money, and if you buy their characterization that they go for, that Nixon will be super involved, right? Because he wants to boost his domestic politics ratings. That means that the government people will be the ones in power, the ones in leadership of these programs, that pushes community and grassroots people out of office. So even if you buy our absolute worst case, you don't trade off in terms of resources, you trade off in terms of the leadership of those resources, because those are fungible. The people leading the ones to clinic, leading the community outreach program, being sought after first for their experience in the legal system, are not ones that have the most relatable experiences, but are white-facing individuals that do not understand the problems that minority communities have systemically gone through, but they give the like, don't do drugs, just go out and vote types of prescriptive advice. That is actively bad because it means you're not able to get the types of reforms that you want to. It also just means the advice is probably bad, right? Like if you get these types of advice that rings hollow, then you're not able to learn from it. You're not able to actualize yourself better in society. So it creates a lot of those long-term complications, long-term problems that is probably bad for minority communities on an individual level. Second, though, the reason why it's bad is it creates the illusion of solvency. Because first, just notice how badly their offense has shifted in the round. PM says we get more people to join the Black Panthers because they seem more in charge. They get more support from the government. MG then walks us back and says, no, they won't join the Black Panthers, but MLK's party. Because now you at least view the Black Panthers as an acceptable part of society because you shift the Overton window. Note, if these people are not going to join, there's no reason to actually pander to them. That means you don't care about moderates in the first place. They lose that ground. This is why you care about the more radical leftists and people and care about those people on the margins, right? And Gov's response to this is, but where are these people going to go? You have nowhere to go except to be in your party. First, Elo says simply that they could just be disillusioned, right? If you think that this is not working for you, if you see yourself actively catering to Nixon, then you're not going out harder to vote or harder to push for these types of radical reforms. You simply just don't engage at all. So even if you don't go to another party, you don't engage in any party. But all of it just gives you the better example that you could splinter from your own parties, right? You just have smaller radical movements, but you don't coalesce into a bigger push than you need to try and get these policies passed, right? That's why you care about them on the margins. That's where they go to. Government cannot respond to that. They lose this round. Third, though, just by their best case, we told you that their side is one of corralment. Because yes, the government supports you and loves you, but it's not unconditional. It is one on the conditionally of no violence or nothing that they deem to be violent. The problem, though, is the government is actively racist, actively violent, etc. They buy into this characterization that damns them in the round. Why? Because the same reasons why government likes to over-police in the stat school, likes to assume that Black people are inherently violent or preeminently judge them, means that they're more likely to overly shut down on those policies when anything controversial comes up that the Black Panther wants to push, or anything meaningful that they want to push, or that could start something, they actually disengage it, they stop it then. This means that you're never able to get the long-term change that they want on their side of the house, but rather you only get the types of like Uncle Tom policies for being able to push for meaningful reforms. You're never able to get that. This is bad because in the status quo, Black people just came out of segregation. Yes, the Civil Rights Act was passed, but exactly that's the point. People just say, the Civil Rights was passed. We don't need to do anything else, but we need to push for more radical reforms in terms of decreasing the wage gap, increasing the way that we just normalize discourse within society, or just the types of implicit racism. They don't get that meaningful push on their side of the house, which is because people think, this illusion of small solvency. How do you weigh this up? Because it prevents you get a bunch of small reforms, but none of them are actually meaningful. None of them matter. They just stick on paper. However, you just lose out on political capital. What do you weigh up on our side? That's what actively beats them. First, this argument of community trust, right? Because we realize that more people trust them now because there's inherently no connection to the government. And in fact, you can say that you actively shout on the government to do your own clinic. This means that if you buy that people have had negative experiences with large institutions, you get more support on that side of the house. This matters in terms of chronic reforms. Right? They try to hand wave this away by saying, if it's chronic, then it's significant, then you go back to that. No, we told you that chronic means that it bothers you on a day-to-day level, but because of the opportunity cost, you don't access these institutions. Now you have a reason to because you feel like you'd be listened, you'll feel like you'd be catered to, which means you actually seek help and you seek more relatable help. The quality of advice matters than any types of quantity they can provide. Weigh that up for the round. We're very proud to oppose.
All right. Okay. Let's start time. We basically just heard a very flippant case from opening opposition. Not only did we not hear any mechanization for a handful of claims that they made, it was never proven why, for example, you would sell out all of your aims to the Nixon administration, that they would demand these massive concessions from you that you would make. That was an argument you had to prove. You cannot just assert that you ultimately become a pawn of the Nixon admin. They also did not prove that the most meaningful thing people care about is whether or not what your funding source is the federal government as opposed to a handful of liberal donors in your city, or that people would even know that this is your primary funding source. These are all things that actually had to be proven by op. They cannot just state them and therefore they win the round. Okay, first argument, this helps protect you. The first thing I want to say is that if you are not protected, you will never get any of your goals, period. Nothing. There are two reasons why. One, we told you that when the organization is at physical risk, people are not likely to tie their name up in it. They're not likely to donate to it. They're not likely to go volunteer for it because they are putting themselves at risk by attaching themselves to an organization that is being actively targeted by the state, and most people would prefer not to die. Secondly, we also told you that people are not likely to support you in terms of the moderate coalition that you're talking about if the state portrays you as a violent actor only that is unwilling to work within the system. This is the alternative that opposition needs to defend, given that they've conceded these warrants, right? So their alternative of you are going to get lots and lots of donations doesn't stand up because people will not donate if they are putting themselves at risk, or even if they do get donations, they're only getting it from the very, very small group of incredibly radical people who do not care what they're tying themselves to, which Max has already explained have a maximal incentive to donate to you on either side of the house. But Max also told you that these people have the least income and are probably not able to support a massive health system in major cities, so you still do not achieve any of your gains. Therefore, their alternative is one of stagnation and destitution. You cannot actually help people. Why do we remedy this? There are 3 reasons why. 1, you get the state off your back. We told you we will use this money for nonviolent purposes, so it is unlikely the state will be applied to officially attack you, attack government-funded offices that are extension of the Department of Social Services and Medicare. That is, there is now a competing political incentive that the Nixon admin needs to weigh up. Yes, they do not like civil rights per se, but on the balance, they are also more likely to let you slide because they want the war on poverty to succeed, to show that they're willing to make constructive changes for poor people, to get people off of their back in terms of things like Vietnam and Watergate. So it's just a lot more likely that the Nixon administration is not actively targeting you or sending the FBI after your offices, and that is a benefit. But second, even if you can't get the federal government off of your back, you now have local support. So opposition conceded that moderate liberals might be sympathetic to your cause, but we provided the nuance, which is that right now they will support moderate and nonviolent organizations that are currently not perceived to be the Black Panther Party. We changed this because we show that your organization is actually improving conditions on the ground and is willing to work pragmatically. Now, the counterfactual claim is actually the more important one, right? Because we don't actually think you're going to be massively upholding the fact that you're getting government money on our side of the house. It's that when you reject this funding, you will now be demonized. It means that the state will now use the fact that you rejected money to go apeshit on you, for prosecutors to make the argument that you have expressed no interest in working through nonviolent mechanisms, for local politicians to say that you are not an organization that is worth playing nice with and that you should be targeted by local police. It makes it incredibly hard for you to mount a meaningful political coalition in the city, which is the most meaningful way for you to get protection from the state, which means that you will be attacked and you will not have people having an incentive to work with you. On our side, the state is likely to play ball with you. The local government is likely to give you some degree of protection, and this local protection then incentivizes more people to work and participate.
So I get the argument that the federal government might want to play ball, but I haven't yet gotten the argument that the local government is going to give you protection.
It's there. It's the argument. Right after I talked about the federal government, I said, even if the federal government, let me just pull it up.
We'll take it under consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's cool.
I don't even think it needs to be elaborated on. Okay.
But also, if I could add, there was a new response in MO about how local and federal operations would be decoupled. So even if it's new, it's a response to that.
Yeah,
Okay,
but it's not
we'll
new.
take
so-
it under consideration.
So you have local protection. Now, again, the weighing on this argument is on their side, everyone is afraid about their safety, so no one participates. On our side, some people might be mad because they really care about your political ideology, but a handful of people who care about getting healthcare without putting their lives at risk will work with you, will volunteer, will support you. You are expanding your coalition versus the no coalition that they have. Second overall point that we win on, though, is the overall balance of support. Even if you clear the security barrier, we're still better off. They've conceded the warrant, which is that radicals are likely to support you either way. They have a revealed preference to risk their lives right now to work for the most left-wing organization, which you will still continue to be on their side. These, however, are not the vast majority of people. We tell you that the vast majority of people work a job, have children, need income, need a lower risk. They see strength in numbers and they want to be safe. We eliminate a number of constraints to our success with these groups. One, you have money to pay people because the vast majority of people will not spend time doing work if they're trading off with work they could do elsewhere. And you can offer more services, which is people are more willing to engage in activism if they know they'll have things like legal protection and healthcare. Their alternative is let people just donate and fill this gap. We told you, one, you're actively going to be targeted, so the vast majority of people will not donate. The moderate white liberals who actually do have money will certainly not donate. So at best, they get a small number of radicals with even less money donating to a cause that can never attain a critical mass. Also, if we simply prove the argument that people will not massively hate you, then even if you have some money on their side, we have a lot more. There is no trade-off. And the dependency argument doesn't work either because efficacy, as I proved to you in the third point of our second argument, is what actually increases your access to support. Proving in the short run that you can actually give people healthcare, you can actually train activists, etc., is what proves that you're a cause that's worthy of support, which actually means you can build an organic base even if the government pulls your plug later on in the future. So why will people not hate you? One, you don't have to advertise it. Two, the radicals that they're linking to have nowhere to go. But three, we think that most people prefer having access to healthcare over ideological purity and having security over ideological purity, especially when all of the other hospitals that they're defending are even worse for Black people. At least Black people are treating Black people in our institutions. So on the balance of probabilities, our alternative is better. We win this debate.
Yeah, what's the point of order?
This is a very small. Wait, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is very small, but the argument that you can't about publicly announcing it, I think is new.
Max just said very few people are going to know about this. And all I said at the top of my speech is you actually had a burden to prove they would publicly announce and propagate this, which you've never proved.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
I mean, we'll take a look in the MG and the PMR, and we'll take it under consideration.
Thank you.
Let me end the recording.